in Astoria right now and works in the city. And then one of my grandchildren, my daughter lives in Connecticut, but comes into an office. And so we have a lot of toing and fromming back
Nice.
into the city. Okay, so we are live and I'm going to introduce you properly. Hi, I'm Frank Schaeffer, and this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And today my guests have written a book called We Pray Freedom, and here it is. And it is edited by, well, it's been put together by two people. So edited is the wrong word. It's been inspired by and collected by Liz, and say your name one more time, Charon, right?
Charon, yes.
Sharon. Okay. So Liz and Sharon have put this book together, and I have read it carefully, and I'm going to prove it by showing you the pages
Dog
there
ears.
and the dog ears, and they aren't
I love
fake
it.
because on each one of these dog ears goes whole sets of notes and things I've written and stuff I want to do. And we're going to run out of time before we've done it all, but obviously I was engaged. So let me just read this introduction properly off the boilerplate here. Um, so my guests today are Reverend Dr. Theoharis. Did I say that right? And now say your last name, Hribar.
Rebar.
Hribar. So you told me before, but I'm very bad on this stuff. And they've written this book, We Pray Freedom, and it is a wonderful collection of prayers, liturgies, services, ideas for people who see prayer as a tool for social activism. And we're going to get into that as well as what prayer is, which is a conversation with God. Um, and they have collaborated to bring together everything from, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, and other people that we would think of in the context. But I think, to me, the most, should we say, original part of the book was, and I'll do one example by reading it out loud a little later, in terms of liturgical practice, including communion and even the Day of the Dead, in terms of Mexico and other cultures that do that, that lend themselves to carrying a message of advocacy for the underdog across the board. That could be the impoverished or the homeless or whomever. So I think the first thing I want to say is just congratulate both of you and say this is an original concept. And I really like this book. And I hope that our audience buys it and reads it, but more importantly, uses it. And I want to say right up front that one of the things you do is in the book, you have a site they can go to for a sort of a continuing engagement with it. And Ernie will post that everywhere this is. So you don't need to talk about it, or whether you can, but we are going to put it out there. So I picked one tiny little passage, I think it was on page 40, that I wrote here. As I told you, I have notes everywhere. And you can see I wrote open with this, and I'm going to read it. Central to our mission is the act of making the invisible visible. And by the way, I love that line. I just think that is absolutely terrific. Central to our mission is the act of making the invisible visible. We refuse to allow our people to be dehumanized or marginalized. Through rituals, prayers, songs, and actions, we celebrate the beauty and dignity inherent in every person, reclaiming narratives that highlight our interconnectedness with one another and the earth. And if I was your publisher, that's what would be on the back of the book, because that is your book in a nutshell, unless I misunderstood it. Do you like the quote I chose?
Love it. That's definitely right at the heart.
Yeah, that's it. That's your book. So what I want to do is, first of all, talk to you as humans and not as authors and editors. And then once we've discovered who you are a little bit, we're going to get into why you made this book, how you two know each other, how this came together, how you hope it's going to be used. And then I'm going to go through dozens and dozens of places until we run out of time, where I've marked things to read and ask you to explain further. So let's get personal first, and I'll show you what I mean. If somebody asks me what I do, they're expecting me to say, well, I'm a writer and I do this, that, and the other. What I do is take care of my grandchildren and love my wife I've been with for 55 years. That's what I do. The rest is a footnote. Um, and basically, when I say take care of my grandchildren, I have 5 grandchildren. 3 of them live across the street. The oldest is now 17. And I have personally, along with my wife, hands-on for 17 years, done all their childcare. They've never had a babysitter. That is what we did. We both took sort of more early retirement because that's what I do. I also continue to work for a living, including doing this podcast and talking to people like you about your books. But if you want to know who I am, in about 10 seconds, my grandchildren will come into play. And then knowing them, you will know why I call myself an atheist, but also one who prays, because I was raised in an evangelical background. I left that, but I pray a lot. I pray without ceasing because there are people I love and I want to thank someone for them, whether I believe that person exists or not. So that's who I am. Now, who are you, Liz? We'll start with you. Who are you?
It's a good question when you put it that way. I mean, I think it's a little hard to separate um, who I am from my commitment to doing faith-based social justice
Mm,
organizing because I was raised in a family that did that. My father was an atheist. My mom was a very ardent Presbyterian lay leader and interfaith organizer. But I'm also a mom, uh,
mm,
and I'm also a wife um,
mm,
and partner, and um, and so much of my life for really its entirety
yeah.
has been at this intersection of praying and freedom. I mean,
Mm,
to be
mm,
honest,
mm.
and so it's hard to take that out of um, like my teenage kids saying like,
Sure.
why do we always have to go to the to all of these protests and all of these church services and all of these
Mm.
actions? Uh, but then also, it's some of who I am.
Sure. Let me roll that back a little bit because I always wonder. Sometimes my wife and I joke where we meet a young woman or a young man and we're saying, hey, that was the type of person I could see them always putting their hand up in class. And, that's who they probably were. Hey, I have. So who were you as a little girl? And that question leads to where did this passion come from? So when I say, who are you? Roll it back a little bit. When did you start being that kind of person for whom social justice means so much? Where did that start? Who were you when you were, if I had been doing daycare for you, what did I have on my hands here in terms of a social justice activist? What would have been the signs that tell me, hey, someday she's going to make trouble out there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, on the one hand, I don't remember a time when I wasn't going to protests and actions and church services. Like I I know when I was 2 and 3 years old, I had a little Winnie the Pooh bag that
Yeah,
came with me everywhere. It had
yeah.
little balls, it had coloring books. Um, and I would just kind of, you know, entertain myself and listen in on all the things.
Mm,
I this summer it was really funny. I was leading worship for a Presbyterian like church school
mm,
for over a week, and my childhood soccer coach was in the group of congregants for this
mm,
like 600 family, and it was really funny to get to interact with him
mm,
about who I was as a little girl
mm,
versus who I am as a 49-year-old woman. Um, and he was kind of saying, like, you're really the same. Like, you were like, when I would
sure.
play soccer as a little person, I was always like fearless and kind of, dance to my own drum. And then he's just like, um, but that's how you are. That's how you are now.
That's
Like
who you are.
that he also could never have imagined a time when I wasn't kind of out there making
Mm,
trouble. Though I have to say, my mom, who was a total troublemaker herself in all the right ways, used to feel like I followed the rules too much.
yeah.
So there was a time when I was very young when I thought you were supposed to like, park between the lines. I'm not
Mm,
sure I ever thought you were supposed to color between the lines, but uh I was less of a rule breaker as a tiny child than I am now. But my mom always raised me, again, I can't even remember a time when she wasn't
mm,
saying this, that if you weren't kind of pushing the bounds. Like if people weren't responding, including negatively
Yeah.
to what you were doing, we probably weren't doing the right
You weren't
thing. And she
doing
would
that.
say to my brother and to myself and to my sister, she wasn't trying to raise baseball players or ballerinas.
Mhm,
She was
mhm.
raising folks that were gonna do the work of justice.
Is your mom still with us?
She's not. Neither of my parents are.
When
They
did she pass away?
She passed away in June of, I guess, 2020. It was very early on. She
Well, that's
didn't
Yeah.
pretty
die from COVID.
that's still pretty recent. So that's a
Yeah.
big thing. And how about your dad?
He died about a year later. So both of
A-
them within 5, 6 years. And
And how old are your kids in the context of getting to know their grandparents before they died?
yeah, they were very young. My kids are now 13 and 16. And
Yeah,
so, they were and the last 5+ years of my parents' lives were they weren't fully themselves
they were
anymore.
fraud. Yeah. So basically their memory of them is going to come through you.
Yes. I mean, though they have patchwork memories, but and for the last 5 years of my parents' life, they lived with my brother and his kids, and
Hmm.
their cousins are very close to them. And so they there's more of that kind of firsthand accounts of,
Mm,
now as they get older.
sure. And Sharon, talking about your background in terms of the who are you question, let's sort of go backwards here. When did you become the kind of person who would sit down with Liz years later and decide that what you need to do is provide people with liturgies, and we pray freedom, which is the book I've got here, so that they could use those liturgies, but put a kind of barb in them, if I want to put it that way, that they'd also teach something that would, require some sacrificial involvement. This isn't just, performative liturgy that you've written here. I mean, who are you in terms of the deep background that gives
Yeah.
us that person?
I mean, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania in a small steel town north of Pittsburgh, and I'm the youngest in my family, both in my immediate family. I have two older siblings that are like 12 and 14 years older than I am,
Yeah.
but I come from a really large family. My dad was one of 12, and my mom, there were four, but they also had lots of
And what
cousins.
sort of people were they in terms of faith, no faith, profession, no
We grew up
profession?
Catholic, mostly. My mom's side was pretty, my mom especially was very devout, Roman Catholic and is
Yeah.
still. And my dad's side, so we're Eastern European, and so my family actually came from kind of more Eastern Orthodox traditions, but then in the
From
US.
where in Eastern Europe or Central Europe?
My dad's side now, like when you after
Sure.
we're from my grandmother was Croatian and my grandfather was Slovenian.
Yeah.
And then on my mom's side, she was Slovak and Polish.
Yeah.
So
So they
yeah,
came from places that ceased to exist and started to exist again in other forms.
exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And how much of that inheritance did you get in growing up, as in, um, talking about their childhoods, or was it something they kind of left behind?
I think in a lot of ways, there's like remnants, but it was definitely, I think, left behind. My mom's generation was the last that spoke the language. Like my
Sure.
grandmother and my mom used to speak in Slovak, so we wouldn't understand what they were talking when they wanted to talk about us in
Mm,
front of us.
mhm. Yeah. Good
They
move.
would, or they would write, my mom would write our Christmas lists in Slovak, so we couldn't read
Mhm.
it. But I did, I got to learn some of the songs, which I'm a cultural organizer now. So that's always been, I think, an
Yeah.
important piece to me. So my grandmother would sing, songs in Slovak. And there was also my dad's family were tamburitsins, which is a music that comes out of Croatia. And
Mhm.
they actually, his uncle had a band, a tamburitzin band. They actually have old records that, my family would play. They played at my parents' wedding.
That's
And
great.
I have cousins that actually, there's a school in Pittsburgh called Duquesne University that they still have like a tamburitzin program there that
Yeah.
I had several cousins be part of that program.
And
So
are you kind of like Liz, as in today with your kids and so forth? Are they asking you why they have to go to all these actions and things, or not?
Yeah, for sure, definitely. Well, the little one still likes it, so I'm sure he'll get to the point where
Mhm.
the older one for sure is kind of, what's going on. And he always liked, though, as an artist himself, he liked helping to lead art builds, which we did a
Yeah.
lot of. He liked actually was a really good teacher for screen printing and button making. So that side of it he liked. My little one, who's 4, is very much a front man.
Yeah.
Yeah, as soon as I'm in the front of the room leading music or talking, he's gonna run up right next to me and
Mhm.
ask for the mic and want to lead songs and chants and or he'll be up there drumming. So he's been to lots of protests and actions and events where he's right there, sporting the "We pray freedom, we cry justice" slogans
So
with us.
what's your relationship, just to drill down a little bit here, in terms of We Pray Freedom, with your connection with the sort of what you would call a more classically um, conservative background of Catholicism and or Eastern Orthodoxy? Because it isn't that this book is a contradiction of that. It's very much in line with big chunks of that.
Mhm.
But nevertheless, uh, you have taken a slightly different path. So would you consider yourself a Roman Catholic? I know how would you define yourself to someone who just sits down next to you and says, the old American question, where do you go to church?
Yeah, I
Who are
mean,
you
I
now?
think, there is a wide variety of reality and practice within the Roman Catholic Church. And
I
I,
know. Yeah,
really was steeped in that growing up. As I mentioned, my mom was a very, devout Roman Catholic, and
sure.
she taught
Now,
Sunday
when you say
school.
was, did she pass away?
No, no, she still is, but
Okay, she's still good.
I'm thinking backwards. But yeah, she's still here and
Yeah,
I take her to church. She's been staying with me, so I take her to church every Sunday.
yeah. Do you ever go
Um,
with her?
yeah, no, that's what I mean. We go
Yeah.
together. But no, I think I was always one, even as a kid, very young. I could remember my mom, we would recite prayers every night
Mhm.
before going to bed. There's a very long laundry list of prayers.
Sure.
But I would always pause and stop her along the way, and I would make her dissect, like, well, what does that mean?
What
Well,
did
why
that
would we
mean?
say
Yeah.
that? And yeah, and in church, I would always ask a lot of questions about what we were
Mm,
doing, and I think. I always had these questions about like, well, why are we doing these practices? As
sure.
Catholicism has a lot of ritual in it, but I always wanted to know where it came
Mhm.
from and why we did the things we
Did
did.
you
And
go to Catholic school?
I did not growing up. My family were strong believers in public schools, so I did go
Yeah.
to public school growing up. And then for college, though, I did end up at a Catholic college,
Where?
at Mercyhurst College in Erie, Pennsylvania.
Sure.
And the faculty at that time had a lot of liberation theologians on the
Yeah.
faculty and that really, matched for me with a lot of the questions I had
Mhm.
growing up around like these practices, and then coming to a school and to, folks that were coming at Catholicism from a different perspective, from this liberation perspective.
Yeah.
It opened it up for me in a whole new way and really, led me down the path to the work that, as you said, of writing this book, of working with Liz for the last 20 years.
Well,
To
wait a minute. You've worked with Liz for 20 years.
yeah.
And this is not a throwaway line here, but you both don't look old enough to have done anything for 20 years. I'm
Yes.
73 this summer, and you look like you could tell me you had just graduated high school, and I'd believe you both. So, this
Sure.
activism stuff this outdoor activism, carrying placards has obviously been good for you. Hey, I'm going to just do a little boilerplate here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Please subscribe right now on YouTube, and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, which is a commentary page at frankschaeffer.substack.com. You can also follow my new project at The Gospel of Zip, that's ZIP. You can see the poster back here, a new book that's coming out. Um, Back to this. Okay, so we've talked a little bit here. Let me just dive into the book, because I don't want to waste all my hard work on this book, and I want to show you that I did read it and enjoyed it, and I have a lot to talk about here. The first section, Praying as We Protest, you begin, today many people view ritual and prayer in ways that are formulaic, insular, and individualistic. For people of faith, prayer is often stripped of its dynamic of life-affirming power, while for more secular people, prayer often seems irrelevant or a relic of the past. Across our society, there is a common assumption, whether consciously held or not, that ritual and prayer simply maintain conventional social norms and prop up the status quo. Now, of course, your book does the opposite, and that is the prayers and the ritual and the liturgy serves a purpose of teaching what I would call a more profound lesson, which, to put it in the most simplistic and Christian terms that I grew up with, would be, okay, this is the ritual, but what is the profound meaning that through this ritual actually connects us with what Christ intended in the Christian tradition, which is not always what's on the surface. And that's what your book is about. It's what is the intent under these rituals at the deepest level, as manifested through the homeless person or whomever it may be. So let me take that paragraph as a kind of an introduction of the introduction, which is where you've got it here in the book, and ask you to give each of you, step in on this in whatever order you want, to give me a kind of a definition of how your book and this project is different than what I just read. Why is this different? In other words, what makes this book not just a sort of a left-wing version of performance art, of like the right-wing version of, oh, Lord Jesus, we just pray for this, and it's kind of a personal performance. What is it about what you've done here? And that's not a loaded question, because I don't think it is that, but I want you to explain how your book is different than just one more iteration from a different political standpoint of the same old thing. We're going to use our prayer to actually do this. So you can take that question any way you want and both have at it.
I can start. Um, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, as I mentioned, Liz and I have been working for 20 years together, and in the context of movement building work, and so these aren't one ideas that just we kind of pontificated or just trying out. They really do come from deep work in community and from people that are living out their faiths and like having like it's not just saying that prayer is an action, but it is about how people live their lives and are having to respond to the needs and crises in their communities and around them. And so I think we've seen, in this work just that many people, still come with the faith traditions that they've come from,
Sure.
from all different faith traditions. But what happens is I think in this work, you're able to also kind of reimagine and actually see like a lot of these stories that come, I'll start with Christianity because that's where I'm coming from, out
Sure.
of the Bible, are other communities that have struggled, right? And so, I think what we've seen is, when you start to realize like, oh, this story of Jesus, celebrating communion in the context of the Roman Empire, it wasn't just, to have this performative, lifting up of, at that point of, incarnation. It was people were, suffering, and this idea of doing this
Mm.
in remembrance of me was about, communities that were gathering because there weren't places, to gather, and there
Yeah.
weren't places to
Yeah.
remember those that were killed and died in the midst of the Roman Empire,
Mm.
right? Or when people gathered, looking at the Exodus story we told, and of some of our Jewish colleagues that have like reimagined the Passover Seder,
Mm.
that powerful story of Exodus, of being liberated from slavery in Egypt, that was people, struggling and figuring out a way out of no way, right? And to
Mm.
people seeing that, oh, this isn't just something I go to whatever, the synagogue or to church on a
Yeah.
Sunday to like have this personal relationship with God. It's actually, there are real lessons here that they've been able to glean from these powerful texts of poor people and
Mm-hmm.
other oppressed people in history. And say like this is the power of retelling these stories in this moment, because we too are working toward liberation. We too are working to see a different world that we believe is possible and
Mm-hmm.
that we believe God wants for this world.
And Liz, I'll just give you something to sort of key your answer off of. We've got a little quote again early in the book here. This book of rituals and prayers emerges from grassroots organizing, which you two have been doing, and social movements led by the poor to end poverty and its interlocking injustices. The liturgies of liberation found in these pages are offered by everyday people, community organizers, pastors, and scholars committed to the abolition of poverty. So key off that and just talk about you and Liz and your, I mean, you two's history together and how you worked on these issues. And again, where did this book come from out of that 20-year experience? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, really appreciate that. I mean, I think again, I mean, there's 80 contributors to this book, right? And those 80 contributors come from all walks of life, but especially um, unhoused folks struggling without healthcare, um, and many different people and leaders of grassroots organizations that Sharon and I have worked with for the past 20 plus years. And indeed, it is kind of everyday people. It's just, it's folks of different races and ages and faith traditions,
Hmm.
and but who are committed to kind of uplifting the human condition. And I was thinking both when you read that quote and when Charon was talking about some of the examples of pieces that are in this book. I was thinking about I'm a Presbyterian minister, and I'm ordained actually um, in part because of the Freedom Church of the Poor,
Sure.
and this kind of long history and tradition
Hmm.
of kind of seeing justice and Jesus being, really connected. Um, and I was thinking, for instance, about when I was a student at Union Theological Seminary and was talking, it brought some grassroots leaders that were with an organization called Picture the Homeless. Um, that is a group of unhoused and formerly unhoused people in New York City, who came to us at Union Theological Seminary when I was a student because one of their co-founders had been buried at Potter's Field.
Yeah, which is in the
Um,
book, by the way, and it's a very moving section of the book.
it is,
Yeah,
and
and just explain what Potter's Field is for people who might not know.
indeed. So Potter's Field is there are Potter's Fields in cities and towns
Sure.
across the country. They're where kind of poor and unknown sometimes folk are buried.
Yes.
In New York City, the Potter's Field is on Hart's Island, which
Yeah.
is actually under the control of the Department of Corrections,
Mm.
which means that those who are buried there, and there's close to 1 million people, are buried by prisoners. Very poor folk themselves, many
Yes.
cases,
Yeah. Yeah.
who do it with such care because actually folk know that people like them, and that folks that they're related to may end up in Potter's Field. And
Sure.
so, but what was kind of amazing about this kind of the coming together of this liturgy that does end up in the book, was these leaders, these grassroots unhoused folk that were
Hmm.
organizing, for bigger change came and said, there that people are being buried in these mass graves
Yeah.
and being denied memorial services. And they started to tell this story. And
Mm.
and one of my advisors, a professor at Union Theological Seminary at the time, who actually had done a bunch of work on kind of early Christian associations and actually these kind of mutual aid societies and
Yeah.
burial associations of the poor,
Yeah.
just like kind of lit up and was just like, actually the
Mm.
story of communion, the story of kind of early Christian meals,
Yeah.
um, is a story of poor people being too poor to die,
Yeah.
and then kind of coming together, banding together, committing to each other that they would, pool their resources in whatever way,
Yeah.
gather in a monthly kind of gathering,
Yeah.
and lift up those who have passed away that month,
Mm-hmm.
but also commit to making sure to bury them. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
Sure.
and that Jesus is actually tapping into that ritual of
Mm.
of poor people in the ancient world,
Yeah.
um, that had come up with like out of a matter of survival, had come
Mm.
up with
Mm.
this kind of meal and memory,
Yeah.
as well as the kind of economic and mutual solidarity aspect of it. Um, and And so here we had this group of unhoused leaders that were organizing for social justice and change in New York City, and a group of seminarians and scholars who knew a lot about, Christian meal traditions
Yeah,
and the
yeah,
founding of kind of burial associations, who then got to kind of share information with each other. And
yeah,
then came a group of both pastors and kind of ritualists
yeah.
who were just like, okay, how do
What
we
do we
make
do?
meaning of this right now?
Yeah.
And how do we tap into this long tradition
Mm,
of everyday, in many cases, poor people,
mm,
making a way out of no way, and figuring out
yeah.
both how to make meaning of a moment, how to how to mark a moment,
Yeah.
that's really important, and how to do so with the kinds of values.
Well, it's
Um,
interesting you bring that up because, as you will see, once again, I marked this particular passage as the one I chose to read out loud to illustrate what you guys are up to. So, see, and I didn't even get paid to do this. I mean, I just picked it
no,
out. The Potter's
amazing.
Field liturgy, the rituals. And it's wonderful here. It's call to worship from Matthew 27, 1-10. And the leader says, when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. And then voice one says, who decided that we should die? Voice two, was it the shelter? Voice three, was it the HMO? Voice four, was it the government? Leader, they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Voice five, we were found slumped in a subway car. Voice six, we were taken by MTA. Voice seven, we were handed over to NYPD. Voice one, who passed us on to the medical examiner? Voice two, who passed us to the Department of Corrections? Voice three, who handed us over to Hart Island? Voice four, where we were buried as anonymous units in a potter's field. Leader, when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and to the elders. Voice five, we were handed over for a whole lot more than 30 pieces of silver. Voice six, 38,000 of us were handed over to the Department of Homeless Services for 700 million last year. Voice seven, the volunteers of American Salvation Army, Help USA, Samaritan Village, and the Doe Fund received these pieces of silver, the 700 million from the Department of Homeland Services. Leader, he said, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. So then it goes on for another page and a half, but that gives you the flavor of how one of these rituals and liturgies has been so beautifully and movingly put together. So give us the story behind that particular bit in the book. We can't dive into all of them. Tell us, you two dive in here and tell me why that's in the book and how that was put together, and tell us the story of that story.
Hey, Liz, you were setting that up. Do you want to finish kind of?
I'll do a little more and then you can jump in, make a little more meaning of it. But so this is so as this kind of
Hmm.
professors and students and
Sure.
pastors and homeless organizers, start meeting, and start, trying to figure out what to do, both about the actual death and burial of the co-founder of the organization, Lewis Higgins, and as well as the kind of unearthing of what's happening at Potter's Field in New York City. Um, a whole group of folks came together, and we would host them at Union Theological Seminary, and we actually held the first interfaith kind of memorial service for those that had passed away and been buried at Potter's Field, in Union Theological Seminary's chapel. And what you were just reading is kind of like almost like a midrash, more
Sure.
from the
Yeah.
Jewish tradition of taking a biblical, a sacred text and putting it in conversation with kind of interpretations of the day. And
Hmm.
so what you were reading was both kind of what shows up in Matthew 28, the Gospel
Yeah.
of Matthew in the
Yeah.
New Testament, which is actually a story about Judas trying to return the money that he got
Sure.
for betraying Jesus, and then the temple elites deciding that they can't take the money back and they can't kind of
Mhm. Yeah.
forgive Judas, but what they'll do with his money is start a potter's field, right? And that this is it's literally a potter's field that started. So what the leaders of Picture the Homeless and some of the clergy and seminarians we were working with did was kind of write this midrash that both has
Sure.
that passage and then has kind of a modern day application of it and
Yeah.
interpretation of it and kind of adding to it, right? Where
Mhm.
talking about the reality
Yeah.
um, of and so we felt like it was really important to include this,
Yeah.
both because there are potter's fields all across the
Yeah, they're
country.
real. And you have in your further consideration section, which by the way, at the end of each section or chapter, whatever we're calling these, there's a little section of meditation with 2, 3, 4 questions that's saying, having read this, had you ever heard of a potter's field before? What do you know about this? And so on. So essentially, the reflection at the end of each section helps you dive a little deeper into the meaning. So Sharon, just talk a little bit about where this ritual that I just read a little piece of the many that are in the book, where have you seen this actually done? And what was the context in which you've seen it done? Not in your book, but for real out there somewhere.
Sorry, I this particular ritual or all like
Yeah,
any
this
of
one.
them?
Any of them, but let's go to this one. Has this been done anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it is a contemporary, memorial service, and I
Yeah.
think those take place all the time in our movement, especially when,
But have you
whether
seen
it,
the one that's in here used as it
oh,
in this book?
well, yeah, I mean, I like Liz mentioned it was that particular one was lifted up at Union Theological Seminary
Yeah.
and by the Picture the Homeless folks.
Mhm.
And others haven't had a chance to use it yet.
Sure. Well, they will because it's a
Yes,
very powerful
exactly.
thing. I think
But
this is going to become quite
And
quite a
and one thing real quick, and then John will jump back in, but it was connected to a campaign
yeah.
that Picture the Homeless was waging against the city to be able to get access
Yeah.
to actually Hart Island and the Potter's Field there. And
Yeah.
so the same liturgy was used in services then once clergy and homeless leaders were able to win
Yeah.
the right to be there.
Yeah.
And so I think it went from being inside like a more formal cathedral church-like space to then
Yeah.
being an outside ritual. Um, and again, we've talked to many leaders that are holding these kinds of services.
Yeah. Are some
And
of them
we
holding them on the island itself? Have they been
yeah,
allowed
yeah,
to
so
do
so
they
that?
good.
you
No,
go.
yeah, just that. I mean, part of that campaign, as Liz was mentioning, was giving the right for folks to actually go to the island.
Yeah, sure.
Like that wasn't allowed before because of the relationship with the Department of Corrections, but they won the campaign, to be able to actually go and hold memorial services for,
Hmm.
both members of the Picture of the Homeless community, but then also other family members were like of anyone that had passed
Yeah.
away, were now able to actually go and pay respect to those that had died. And so, that was a pretty powerful moment of a place where no one was allowed to, go and see deceased family members because they were too poor to be buried. Now, that campaign was able to open that up for a whole community of people. Like Liz said, over 1 million people buried there, that were now able to, go and hold services. And there were actually
Mm.
different faith communities that were, are and still going and like offering services
Sure.
regularly where others can join to be
Yeah, so
part of
people aren't
those.
just disappearing without a trace. I was
Right.
interesting, you were talking about people sort of falling between the cracks. The other day, I had to renew my driver's license and I was down at the DMV. And now, because of the Trump initiative, it can't be just a license. It has to be a kind of an all-purpose ID. So I needed to take 4 pieces of paper proving I'm here and so forth and so on. And kind of onerous, but I had everything in order because I'm the kind of person that owns a passport and knows where his social security card is the person checking in next to me didn't have anything and couldn't fulfill any of the requirements because he's homeless. But he wanted to renew his driver's license, now could not because he didn't have all this stuff because he doesn't have a fixed address and that's required. So that it was just a tiny example and a good setup for reading your book in terms of, yeah, there's a real world out there of everybody who falls below a certain line. And the system is not only geared to not help them, it's geared to deprive them even of the minimum ability to function.
Right. And to
Because,
criminalize them at
yeah, they are
worst,
now
right?
criminalized. You cannot drive. So you're living in your car and now you can't drive it because you don't have a fixed address. And it was just a tiny example that kind of fortuitously prepared my head to read your book, with a very kind of open heart. Not that I wouldn't have before, but I just want to go to something in here in chapter 3 that's headed Mourning. Poor and dispossessed people must create spaces to mourn in a society that says that some lives matter less than others. When in the middle of a global pandemic, the nation deems workers, quote, essential, but fails to give them the essentials they need to survive, we must have space to weep. I just thought, again, that was a very incredible paragraph, so well written, standalone kind of a thing. Talk about that concept of providing spaces to mourn and how that's translated into your activism. And again, I just throw it open to both of you, whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, I can jump in first. I think that part of this book is also opening up people to thinking about the many ways that we are organizing and that we are protesting. And oftentimes I think people have a very, one-dimensional idea of like what a march looks like, what kind of activities take place. But in the actual real lives of people, like, we are coming together in many ways to carry that out. And also, I think we are craving those kind of spaces, especially like that paragraph comes connected to a COVID memorial service that we held in Washington, D.C. For the Poor People's Campaign, again, in a time where, people were told to stay home and isolate. But if you were an essential worker, right, you had to go out and you had to work and you had to keep society going and carrying out the activities that, for others that could stay home and shelter, right? Many people, like we had people that lost like dozens of people in their family in the midst of COVID, and yet they're still being told they have to go and carry out the regular like day-to-day lives, so that other people could survive, basically, right? And so the space to say, this is wrong, this isn't normal, this isn't just like applaud you, bang your pots when 5 o'clock comes, and then like don't actually give people health care or don't actually, provide vaccines and all of these things. It was saying like people matter, like they are human beings that have dignity and value and are sacred. And we have to also create spaces where we honor that and stop and say what's happened. Like we lift you up, we lift the loss that you're holding, we grieve with you, right? And we see, we go again to back to, biblical stories that, there are many stories where they're coming together to wail, and the wailing is about calling out, the injustice of that. And so part of our organizing is making space to say like that wailing is about calling out this injustice. And it's not their own, like someone's happenstance that they died. It was actually, a situation where, conditions were created where they didn't have to actually die. And so that public grieving is an outcry,
is a big
right?
part
and
of that. Yeah.
Calling this out. Yeah.
I'm going to move to some other questions here, but before I do, I just want to ask you both a favor, and that is when we end this podcast, which will not be soon because I'm nowhere near done talking to you guys. But when we get there, please stay on and talk to my producer, Ernie, after I sign off for two reasons. One, we want to make sure we have your information that we can share to push our audience to not just read the book and how to get it, but also to go to your site and click on it and become part of what you're doing, because people will want to. So stick around. And the other question I have for you to also share with Ernie is when you do stick around, please tell us about guests we should be talking to. And it doesn't have to be someone that's written a book, but somebody who has some experience that the people who listen to my podcast should know about that maybe I don't know out there. So do those two favors for me. I want to change the discussion a little bit. And I want to, first of all, just say again, that I recommend this book so highly. I really do. We Pray Freedom, Liturgies and Rituals from the Freedom Church of the Poor. And this is going to be a funny way to recommend this book. And it's kind of a backhanded compliment in an odd way, but it's meant to sincerely. This book comes from a very different place than I do, because I am someone who has moved away from faith, not toward it, but in another way deepened it, in that really tried to decide what's important to me. And this, if this book can move me, then it's meant for a large audience. That's an odd way to put it, but I really mean that. So thank you, really thank you for it. Okay, so I want to get away from the book for a second and just go to sort of some broad philosophical / political discussions. There's no way to read this book or talk to you and avoid the context in which I'm reading it. So we've talked about your book here as if we're all in outer space and this is all theoretical up to this point. We're not in outer space. This is not theoretical. The entire direction of our nation right now and the popular vote that put Trump in the White House, you couldn't publish a book that is more of the moment and yet more countercultural. This is as countercultural as you can get. The legalization of weed is nothing compared to this. The, sex worker views, nothing compared to this. This is countercultural. This runs in the face of everything we now are, whether it's canceling foreign aid, rolling back the program in Africa for helping AIDS survivors. It doesn't matter where you touch our culture now and its effect on the world. In the Trump era, this is an inflammatory countercultural statement. You can't get further from this, from where we are. And you've done it in a way that is even deeper, because you were quoting the passages of scripture and other religious traditions that are being used by White House advisors who are whispering in Trump's ear, and other people in the White House, including the press secretary wearing her cross and so forth. They are parading their, quote, Christianity as a badge. Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation, being run by conservative Roman Catholics in the most part. So I know that's a long preamble, but I'm not going to load this question, but I'm going to ask you how you see yourselves and your book and its message. More than that, your lives, the last 20 years of your activity, in the context in which it would appear from a human standpoint that the battle that you are fighting has been absolutely irrevocably lost. How do you see yourselves in that context? I'm not saying it has been lost, but I'm saying if you just read the headlines, you're on the losing side and it's going the other way. I am too, by the way. How do we see ourselves in this context?
I really appreciate this because I think it's what's in a lot of people's minds right now, right? And I think part of the reason it's in a lot of people's minds is that when we actually look at the polls, the majority, the vast majority of people think we
Yeah,
should have healthcare universally, think we
sure.
should have expanded voting rights, believe we should have a just immigration policy, which is not what we have, right?
Right.
And just like kind of down the line. And actually, the majority of people of faith, including Christians, including
Mm.
even evangelical Christians,
Yeah.
are pro-choice.
83% of whom voted for Trump and put him in the White House.
Of those that voted.
That's what I'm saying. But
Yeah,
that's all
of those
that
that voted.
matters in this context. That's all that matters. We don't care what polls say. It's like who votes and why do they vote? Because where were you if you didn't vote? I
Well,
mean,
and I
then,
think that
That's
I
the,
think
yeah.
this is part of the question or the point that we're making,
yeah,
is that, you know, the majority of people that identify as Christians, even evangelical Christians,
sure.
agree with so many things that people would not associate with Christianity these days, given
Mm,
what you were just putting out. Given the very high up in power, you know, Christians of this
sure.
day, and this kind of
Yeah,
equal sign between extremism and hate and like, you know, punting the poor
sure.
down, um, and Christianity, which
Yeah.
couldn't be more twisted than what the Bible really says
Yeah.
and what our faith traditions really uphold, but also what the majority of people of faith actually believe. And so then if we start there, if we actually talk about what people agree with,
Mm.
not with who voted for who or how many people voted or
Yeah.
how many people didn't vote.
Good point.
If we start there, then actually rituals and liturgies and
Mm.
stories and songs that are coming out of communities in this moment are are they're countercultural in that they're completely challenging, you know, the tweeter in chief, right? But but they're actually just kind of summing up what a lot of people believe. And that and I think that that's part of the work, especially for folks that are devoted and who have devoted our lives to doing the work of social justice and racial
Mm.
justice and
Mm. Mm.
economic justice, is how do people start seeing themselves in those that are resisting in this moment,
Mhm.
those who are singing and protesting in this moment? And those protests and those songs don't have to look like regular protests and songs.
Sure, sure.
Um, and so I think to me this is actually part of why we're so excited to have this publication coming out in
Yeah,
this.
and the time it is. And by the way, just to note on the way back through here, wherever we are, I want to make this a special. It has to be read September in our book club. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read that goes with my little It Has to Be Said thing. And we want to make We Pray Freedom here special September addition to our book club to coincide with you bringing it out because we really want to help promote it. Okay, sorry I interrupted you. Keep going and talk a little more about this, both of you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the other thing is, as Liz was saying, this piece on those who voted, but there are like a third of the electorate that isn't voting at all right
Sure.
now. And I think there's less of a question of like, well, how could they not see that they're gonna, let someone like Trump win?
Yeah.
And more of like going back to this, like, well, what are they agreeing on? And I
Mm.
think one of the things they're agreeing on is that a lot of people are hurting, right? And a lot of people aren't hearing either political party actually appeal to the actual real like hurt and struggle that people are going through.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this book is appealing to, though. Like it is like it's coming out of communities who are struggling and who are taking care of one another and who are showing up and
Yeah.
looking for a different way possible. And
Well,
so,
and you don't just talk about it the way we're doing here, because this is
right.
what the podcast is. The book is actually a tool by which you can do these things because you provide these actual liturgical rituals that
Right. And
can be done.
and we are encouraging people to take these rituals and do them or be inspired by them, right?
Yeah,
Use them as
sure.
a way to create your own
Yeah.
as well. But also, I think there's just real lessons of seeing, when you look at those 80 contributors, they're from a whole breadth of
Yeah, of
people
course.
across this country. And
Yeah.
when someone picks this up, you can find yourself in this book,
Yeah,
you and
exactly.
in different days too, in different moments.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think it's really
I have
powerful.
another philosophical question that I want to throw out at you. And again, either of you want to dive in here or, just tell me to get lost if you don't want to do it. That's fine too. I'll still put your book in our book club. Um, but I have a philosophical question that I think, just like the other question about being in the Trump era and this being, we pray freedom being truly countercultural. And by the way, I'm not asking you this as saying, okay, you're of the left now, represent the entire progressive movement, and I'm holding you both responsible for whatever's happened. It's not meant that way. I genuinely am curious, and I'll tell you why. And I don't mean to flatter, but I mean this. There's so much wisdom in your book that I would kind of trust your answer on this because you have the compassion and the wisdom to be truthful, I think, if I can just put it that way. But it seems to me, as someone who likes your book a lot, and it's not a question of tick the box if you agree. It's not that kind of a thing, but wants to promote this. On the other hand, we cannot just say, hey, look at the era we're in terms of Trump, as if he arrived as an invading force from an outer space. One of the reasons Trump is in power, and let's face it, is the failure of the left for the last 50 years, if you want to call it the left, to articulate a vision that goes beyond identity politics and grandstanding leadership when it comes to issues that are somehow depersonalized. Put it this way, taken out of your Potter's Field analogy. In other words, there's no application. They don't apply to anybody. It's just getting your pronoun correct or you're a bad person. Don't talk to you anymore because you voted for Trump. You flew a Trump flag, and so I'm not going to help you put your Christmas lights up like I did last year. The image, the deserved image of not just the American left, but the international left, out of which you have a whole global populist movement coming in Europe, where I grew up. It's not all one story here. It's not a bunch of evil right wingers came over and took things away. They were handed a lot on a platter of total dysfunction, whether it comes to governance in certain cities and certain states. And I'll just give you one example. You know, you cannot advocate for the legalization of drugs on a huge scale and then not make any connection with that and the homeless camp on the edge of your city filled with people who are drug addicted. At some point, the left and the progressives have to put their hand up. And that may be a bad example, but the pronoun thing isn't. It's a good example of just this kind of sanctimonious demand that everybody act as if they went to Stanford and studied humanities there for 4 years and graduated with correct thinking. And if you don't fall into that, you're not of us. I've had a lot of people like the editor of the Wall Street Journal who I've interviewed here, and even people from, right-wing magazines, columnists and others, and a lot of left-wing people too, and then all sorts of people in between. But there are all sorts of serious people out there, like Ross Douthat, for instance, at the New York Times, who are very sympathetic when it comes to what you've got in your book, We Pray Freedom, but don't want to be identified with the kind of performative left, which they feel have given us this Trump era because they have been too sanctimonious. So that's a long question. I am not asking you this as representatives of that, nor am I telling anybody that that's who you are, but you have to have thought about this, because just like I have to think about your book being countercultural, how did we get here? Well, part of the blame, we have to always, one of the things that, your book teaches is you look inside first. You don't talk about other people's anger with their families. You talk about, okay, how did I treat Jeannie today, driving her to her therapy session because she had a broken arm a couple of weeks ago from an exercise class, and we're working through that. Don't start with some proclamation about males dysfunction. Start first about the fact that, take a look at your own relationship. And I think in that spirit, we of the left, or whatever you want to call this, of the people who will love this book, for this to be effective, there has to be some rethinking of the way we come over in the public mind. Okay, I will not say another word. So you heard me out. Thank you. Have at it.
I'll jump in and then maybe Sharon has things, I'm sure. So I really appreciate particularly like needing to look at how we got here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I just think there's a lot to that story, and it's actually kind of simple. I mean, before Trump even took office or was elected, there were almost half of the US population that was living in poverty or one couple $100 emergency away from it.
Sure.
Just in the last couple years before, or really the year before the election, about 25 million people had been winded off of Medicaid expansion because of the kind of pandemic shifts. And so, I mean, it was the largest loss of Medicaid in US history, of healthcare in US history. Um, if we look at just how people are doing emotionally, materially, and even like health and lifespan wise,
Sure.
we have been going downhill, and that's a combination of the rise of our right wing, but also the complicity of a kind of neoliberalism
Yeah.
that has ended welfare as we know it, has ended public housing as we kind of know it, has promised healthcare and only to kind of take it away, right?
Mm.
And so, and there's so much more that is very simple.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
but it then speaks to this point that Sharon was making earlier of like, if we then enter the election cycle, that brings us Donald Trump for a second time. Um, you know, you had you had someone like Donald Trump who was actually talking about the pain that people were feeling.
Yeah.
Now, who he was blaming that on, what he was doing with that, like whether he was going to actually have any solutions to those problems. I mean,
Hmm.
you know, I I don't believe any of it. I haven't seen it. Um, and you had then kind of the Biden and then Harris like campaigns, mostly trying to like tell people like how good they had done, how good they were doing.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, and so then when we get to the 90 million people who
Mm.
did not vote, um, uh, we have done a lot of work in small towns and medium-sized cities and rural
Yeah.
areas and in major metropolitan areas for decades now. And have really found that, and we've done some studies on this too, that poor and low income people do not vote at the same levels
Yeah.
um, as higher income people do.
Yeah.
Um, and and also like people that are not engaged in the political system doesn't
Hmm.
mean that people are apolitical.
Yeah,
It's
of
that people are
course.
not hearing um, the kind of programs that matter to them. They're not hearing kind of their name and condition.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they have been kind of conditioned to believe that they have no role in improving um, like in kind of political life.
Yeah.
And I just think all of that matters a lot then
Mm.
when we look at this moment because
Mm.
we can, you know, we can have whatever conversation we want to have that leads us to this moment. And
Hmm.
then you can see the response that people are having to it.
Yeah.
And whether that's, thousands of events, including, millions of people, folks that have never been out there protesting
Yeah. Yeah.
before in towns and cities across the country, whether that's just you kind of following on social media and other
Yeah.
like just like the kind of like the sentiment of people
Hmm.
really across lots of walks of life right
Yeah.
now is a deep-seated unhappiness
Mm.
with the programs and policies of Project 2025 and
Yeah.
what Donald Trump represents. And
Mm.
so then the question is, well, we know how we got there because there's been this
Yeah.
complicity in
Yeah.
all of it. But we also know that people aren't happy being here.
But one thing I just want to interject, and the happy news for you is I think you guys have done a good job at answering this already by doing your book. So, um, but I think one of the great deficits of the Democratic Party, and I know Nancy Pelosi, and I've hobnobbed with these guys for years on at various events and so forth, and in person in her home, for instance. And I just want to say that what I've been telling them for 30 years now, having left the evangelical world and coming from a family that created the religious right, that created the MAGA movement, if you want to put it that way, to be blunt about it, you guys have not talked about morality enough. You're always talking about economics. You're always talking about another government program. People may say that to you in a poll that they want more health care, or they want this or that. But believe me, the fury with the left is that it doesn't speak the moral language that they respond to. And fortunately, We Pray Freedom is an example of some people from the progressive side that get that. You can read this book and say, whatever you think of these two women, they believe in words like right and wrong. They believe in words like moral absolute. They believe in words like forgiveness and kindness and mercy, the stuff that everybody longs for, but that the Democratic Party just talks about another $5 billion program. And the reason everybody voted is because of the Rust Belt. And if they had just had jobs, it would be fine. No, the Democratic Party has failed to engage the moral language where most people live. And I would like to throw that out to you and just ask you for a response, because your book has
Yeah.
gone a long way to doing that.
Yeah, I think that's another, I think something we've been working towards for, again, the last 20 years and longer within circles that we
Yeah,
come out of, is that I think a lot, in order to, people think that there's this, like, in order to bring people that are different, coming
yeah,
from lots of different walks of life together, that you have to wash away all of the kind of moral grounding, the kind of
sure.
faith practices that they come from, rather than actually letting people bring all of that with them, right? And
Absolutely.
actually speaking to that and speaking to, this is where we've lost the argument, right? Like
Yeah,
we can't say the word Jesus in progressive spaces, or we can't
yeah,
say whatever faith traditions we're coming from,
yeah,
because we have to water things down to like then not talking about anything,
right.
right? Whereas, like, if we're saying these are the things our faith that Jesus was talking about, like creating, like everyone needed homes, and there is a right and a wrong. It's not about right and left. We say this all the time in
Yeah,
our
of
work, but
course.
there is a right and wrong. And
Yeah,
actually all of our faith traditions are steeped in that. And how do we
yeah,
actually bring that forward and not just avoid it, thinking that
yeah,
people can't handle themselves together?
yeah.
I think what we've seen in doing this work for 20 years of bringing people from very different communities
Mm,
together is that when you bring people together, around shared, deep values, like it's not all of that. You don't have to get into like, where do we start that we're different, but
mm.
where do we start that we actually we care for our communities, we care for our families, we
Yeah.
want people to, but it's not just about the programs. It's coming from a very deep place of, this is how, we were raised, and this is how we want to continue to see our families, our communities, our nation thrive. And so it's not running away from that language. It's
Mm,
actually
mm.
asking people to bring it to the table, right? And it's why, you know, I think in this book, it's actually saying like people are doing this and they're hungry for it, and especially saying it to folks that are organizing. We've come to organize in some ways, in some very transactional ways, or around
Sure.
just every election cycle. And it's like people's whole lives need to be engaged in this
Yeah,
in this practice. And part of that is, this book speaks to all of the layers of our lives. We have to
yeah.
hold people not only to get them to an election or to get them to pass a campaign, but like our family, we have to celebrate the births and the victories of our movements. We
Absolutely.
have to grieve the losses,
Yeah.
and how do we create the space, because
Yeah,
then
and an
people
example
are
of what you're
really.
talking about is I can imagine some of my right-wing friends, and I don't use that word loosely, people who live on my block, who I see every day because I walk my dog Zip, and we talk, and I help them put up their Christmas lights, even when they put a Trump sign in their yard. Their entire instinct as the way they were raised and who they are at the most profound level would be horrified by the idea that somebody would be buried on an island anonymously and could not be memorialized. And they'd be out there with you on that. They'd say, this is wrong. They're a
Yeah,
human being. They were created in the image of God. I don't, they're not a nothing. They shouldn't be just thrown into the ground. I'm with you on this.
yeah,
Why? Because you women have stood up and spoken in a moral language that is really common to a lot of Americans. And you've
yeah. It's
lifted it out of the litmus test stuff into an area where we can all, the funny thing is, a lot of my more conservative neighbors would sign their name to a lot of these things you've done because they would be touched by that in a non-political context.
mhm.
So my word to anybody out there who's a Democratic activist, and if Nancy Pelosi's watching or somebody like that, I'm saying it again, 40 years late, speak this moral language or lose the next election. I'll end my podcast with that and recommend your book highly to everybody and make it on our reading list for September, and stay on with Ernie for a minute to give us some guest names. And before I run off, can I just thank you both from the bottom of my heart for the book? I think you've given us a great gift.
Really appreciate this time, this conversation, how much you've not just read, but like digested and
Mm.
added to its contents.
Well, thank
And
you.
this
Yeah,
is a
and
great
grateful
conversation.
for this idea that people should use it. Yeah, and excited that you all will dive in as a reading group, because I think, yes,
Yes.
it needs to be
And I look
used.
forward to talking to you again a year or so from now when we can get the result of how this played out, but also anybody you think we should talk to, or, you have something to say a month from now, call Ernie and say, I want to be on again because I have something to tell you about, and we'll have you in a heartbeat. So, hey, thank you so much, and all the best with the book.